The idea of mercantilism was to maximize mother country exports and minimize imports, resulting in a current account surplus. The assumption was an increased accumulation of wealth, but ignored the economic costs involved. Mercantilism required regulations, restrictions on colonies, and collecting tariffs at the customs house. The negative effects included dissatisfaction of colonists and consumers at home receiving fewer goods and paying higher prices. In other words, lower economic growth. The colonists wanted only local taxes and regulation. The Navigation Acts of 1650 to 1750 established the mercantile system, with English imports carried only in English ships or those of the exporting country. Major colonial exports, called enumerated articles, such as tobacco, had to be exported to England and pay customs duties. England wanted compliance with their regulation and limited colonial autonomy. For example, no colonial manufacturing. Colonial merchants were good at evading taxes and regulation when it suited them, and disrupting the new English tax bureaucrats when obedience meant poor returns. For example, the Molasses Act of 1733 required molasses to be exported only to British markets, but French Caribbean markets were larger and more profitable. The primary response by merchants was smuggling on a grand scale. The New England merchants had considerable advantages, including huge distances involved when fast and high-tech meant sailing ships, plus the long coastlines, remote landings, the large number of Caribbean islands, and other markets. Equally important were strategic bribes. Payouts of cash and goods became an efficient cost of doing business. The merchant captains still had to evade the British Navy. Merchant profits generally meant free trade. Buy low, sell high, avoid high taxes and customs duties, and make trades quickly. Shipping everything through England more likely meant near bankruptcy than success. Merchant John Hancock probably was the largest smuggler and possibly the richest man in the soon-to-be United States. Hancock was known for his large signature not languishing in debtor's prison. The biggest moneymakers were plantation owners with lots of land under production: tobacco, indigo, cotton, and grains. That meant using slaves where slaves were considered valuable property. This favored the South, with fertile soil, long growing seasons, and public systems that favored large property owners. They typically had London agents to trade their produce and send British manufactured goods to the owners. Now the aristocrats of the South. They likely followed mercantilist practices, paying duties and following shipping regulations. George Washington was an example. Conveniently, he kept his plantation records, and historians tracked Washington's practices. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston were major trade centers of the colonies. The Middle States had forests useful for lumber and shipbuilding. With poor soil, fishing was more lucrative than farming, and both fish and lumber became important exports. Southern colonies started exporting tobacco, then added other crops. England may have demanded direct trade with the colonies, but trade expanded to include 3 or more ports. The most mentioned were sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe, textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa, finally, slaves to America. New England merchant smugglers specialized in rum and goods to Africa, slaves to America, and sugar products from the Caribbean to New England. In fact, dozens of different goods were shipped by all the Western European countries around Europe, Africa, and the New World. The major routes included the Portuguese to Brazil, the British to the British Caribbean, the French to the French Caribbean, and the Spanish to all the Spanish colonies. American trade was relatively small by comparison, with most done with Britain and other American colonies, at least according to official records. Many agricultural products like sugar required brutal labor in inhospitable, often disease-ridden places. The land-owning patricians wanted no part of the brutal conditions and turned to slavery and overseers to get the work done. Slaves had no incentive to work hard. Rioting and running away, on the other hand, could be reasonable choices. African tribes, like other humans around the world, fought other African groups, including the intent to capture and sell them into slavery. Slavery goes back to the ancient world, and African captives were a major export. Europeans expanded the trade for export to the New World, particularly the Caribbean islands and Brazilian sugar plantations. The first slaves arrived on Hispaniola in 1502. Until the slave trade was banned by all European countries, it is likely that another 12 million Africans were destined for slavery in the New World. Slave holders claimed the Africans were less susceptible to malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases of swampy areas. The high mortality of crossing the Atlantic in the 17th century suggested the hardships. Now consider Africans chained below deck and packed close together, ill-treated and ill-fed. These ships were large cargo vessels specifically built for transporting slaves. One plan showed how over 600 prisoners could be crammed in. They suffered from dehydration, dysentery, and scurvy. Records indicate mortality of 15% to a third. Both dead and dying slaves were thrown overboard. The crews also were treated poorly, including flogging, and had high mortality rates as well. It's obvious that food history is complicated. We'll get into the weeds on food and cooking by colonial region next time on Food History and Mystery.